Long before anyone sees danger, someone has already been listening to it. Far below the bridge, beneath the movement of officers, signal lamps, and open sky, there is another room where daylight arrives only as a distant idea. The ceiling hangs low above pipes wrapped in insulation. Electrical panels breathe gentle warmth into the cool air. Fans carry the scent of machine oil through narrow compartments where every surface has learned the slow rhythm of a ship that rarely stands still. Metal speaks quietly here. It creaks when the sea leans against the hull, vibrates when engines settle into steady revolutions, and answers every wave with sounds so familiar that the people inside gradually stop noticing them. The room itself seems reluctant to draw attention. There are no large windows looking across the ocean, no sweeping horizon, no dramatic view of approaching aircraft or distant smoke. Instead, there are cables, switches, indicator lamps, notebooks softened by damp fingers, and a pair of headphones resting patiently beside equipment whose purpose is almost impossible to appreciate at first glance. Outside, thousands of tons of cold water stretch downward into darkness. Inside, nearly everything depends upon sounds too small for ordinary ears. You linger there quietly, watching without interruption as one sailor lowers himself into a familiar chair. His movements are measured not because anyone has ordered them to be slow, but because routine has erased unnecessary gestures. One hand adjusts the headphones. Another reaches toward a collection of carefully marked controls polished smooth by months of repeated use. Around him, other members of the crew continue their own duties almost without looking in his direction. They know where he will remain for much of the day. They know that if he performs his work well, almost nothing will happen. It is one of history's quieter paradoxes that success often sounded like silence. Across the great naval campaigns of the Second World War, enormous fleets crossed oceans that concealed more than they revealed. Merchant convoys carried food, fuel, medicine, steel, and millions of ordinary hopes between continents. Beneath them moved another world entirely, hidden by depth rather than distance. Steel submarines drifted through layers of cold water where sunlight never reached, relying upon patience more than speed, and upon concealment more than firepower. Between these two unseen worlds existed only fragments of sound. The sea has never been silent. Long before engines disturbed its surface, it already possessed its own language. Waves rubbed endlessly against shorelines. Gravel shifted beneath tides. Whales called across astonishing distances. Fish gathered in shimmering schools. Rain stitched delicate patterns onto the water before disappearing into it. Even ice, drifting in northern oceans, produced distant groans as pressure changed within frozen walls. Every voyage entered an ancient conversation already taking place beneath the surface. Then humanity introduced new voices. Steam turbines hummed through steel hulls. Diesel engines pulsed with mechanical certainty. Propeller blades carved invisible spirals through dark water. Pumps, generators, compressors, bearings, gears, anchors, chains, and countless other machines added themselves to an underwater orchestra that no passenger standing on deck could ever fully hear. Each vessel carried its own acoustic fingerprint, unknowingly announcing its presence across miles of ocean. Somewhere, another pair of headphones waited to hear it. The remarkable thing was never that machines produced sound. It was that human beings slowly learned to recognize identity inside those sounds. Experience transformed noise into information. A practiced listener could begin separating one layer from another, noticing rhythm before volume, interval before intensity, pattern before certainty. Listening became less like hearing a conversation and more like studying weather, where small changes accumulated into meaningful signs only after endless observation. None of this happened quickly. No dramatic revelation unfolded inside a single afternoon. Instead, thousands of ordinary hours quietly reshaped the minds of young sailors until they inhabited the sea differently from everyone around them. They entered service with ordinary hearing. They emerged carrying an invisible map made almost entirely of echoes, vibrations, and patient attention. Before you continue into these quiet compartments, where entire oceans were searched through sound rather than sight, consider joining those who return to echoes of war. If these long, reflective journeys through history help you slow your own thoughts, a simple subscription allows you to find the next voyage when the sea grows quiet again. Time moved differently inside these compartments. Above, the ship crossed oceans according to charts, clocks, bearings, and the steady arithmetic of nautical miles. Below, another measure quietly took hold. Minutes were no longer counted only by the hands of a clock but by uninterrupted concentration, by the changing tone of machinery as engines altered speed, by watches that ended only when another pair of careful hands accepted the headphones. A shift could feel strangely brief when the mind remained fully occupied, or impossibly long when every sound resolved into nothing more threatening than the familiar pulse of one's own vessel. The work demanded an unusual kind of patience because it rewarded restraint more often than action. Unlike the gun crews who could see a target through binoculars or the signalman who watched flags rise and fall against the sky, the sonar operator spent much of his service studying absence. He learned not to chase every uncertain sound, nor to fear every unexplained vibration. Instead, he cultivated something quieter, the willingness to remain uncertain without surrendering discipline. In war, certainty was precious. At sea, it was often unavailable. Outside the hull, the ocean refused to simplify itself for human convenience. Warm currents folded over colder layers, bending sound in unexpected directions. Storms churned the upper waters until familiar echoes dissolved into confusion. Calm weather could be equally deceptive, allowing distant noises to travel farther than anyone expected. Even the changing seasons altered how the sea carried voices beneath its surface. Winter waters behaved differently from summer seas, while shallow coastal passages answered sound unlike the immense depths of the Atlantic. The operators were never listening to empty water. They were listening through a living environment that constantly reshaped the very thing they hoped to understand. That relationship with the sea produced a peculiar humility. The equipment represented remarkable engineering for its time, yet every experienced operator understood that technology alone could never replace judgment. Instruments displayed signals, but people assigned meaning to them. A faint contact might be a submarine holding perfectly still beneath a convoy, a school of fish drifting through colder water, another escort crossing at an awkward angle, or nothing more than the ocean rearranging its countless invisible reflections. Between the first uncertain echo and any decision stretched an uncomfortable space filled with doubt, calculation, memory, and experience accumulated one quiet watch at a time. You begin to notice how rarely these men occupied the center of wartime photographs. Cameras naturally sought aircraft lifting into bright skies, destroyers cutting dramatic wakes across rough seas, explosions rising above distant horizons, or exhausted crews celebrating visible victories. The sonar room offered none of these images. Its triumphs often appeared indistinguishable from ordinary routine. A convoy arrived safely because danger had been detected early enough to avoid catastrophe. A submarine slipped away because uncertainty prevented reckless pursuit. Entire voyages concluded without anyone outside the compartment fully appreciating how many careful decisions had quietly protected them from events that never came to pass. For that reason, this story asks for a different pace. It cannot be understood through a sequence of battles alone, nor by measuring victories against defeats. Its true rhythm is found in repetition, watches that begin before dawn, headphones settling once again across familiar ears, notebooks filling with careful observations, machinery humming beneath steady feet, and the endless conversation between steel and water continuing far beyond the limits of human attention. Only after remaining inside that routine for long enough does the invisible world begin to reveal its shape. Beneath the deck plates. The first lesson is not about submarines. It begins instead with the ordinary sounds of a ship that has not yet met an enemy. Long before a sailor learns to recognize another vessel hidden beneath the sea, he must first become intimately acquainted with the one carrying him across it. Every destroyer, corvette, frigate, or escort vessel possesses its own voice, assembled from thousands of small mechanical habits that repeat hour after hour until they become almost invisible to everyone except the people paid to notice them. A newly assigned sonar operator enters this world carrying ears no different from anyone else's. The compartment feels crowded despite its modest size, every bulkhead lined with equipment whose purpose seems intimidating in its complexity. Cables disappear overhead before reappearing somewhere beneath the deck. Indicator lamps glow softly against painted steel. Condensation gathers on colder surfaces whenever the ship moves between different climates. Even before the machinery begins its work, the room already possesses its own atmosphere, one created as much by enclosed air and patient concentration as by electronics. The experienced operators rarely hurry. They move through their routines with the confidence of people who understand that precision cannot be rushed. Headphones are inspected almost absent-mindedly. Connections are checked by touch as much as by sight. Logbooks are open to fresh pages waiting to receive another collection of observations that may appear insignificant on their own yet become valuable through accumulation. Every watch begins with these small rituals because consistency protects attention. When enough tasks become automatic, the mind remains free for the unexpected. Training officers often discover that the greatest challenge lies not in teaching equipment but in reshaping expectation. Many recruits arrive imagining that underwater detection resembles hearing footsteps in a silent hallway, where danger announces itself clearly against an otherwise empty background. The sea refuses such simplicity. It offers no blank canvas upon which an isolated sound conveniently appears. Instead, every moment arrives layered with overlapping disturbances that must gradually be separated through patience rather than instinct. Practice begins with familiarity. The trainees spend hours listening to recordings whose importance is not immediately obvious. Some contain nothing more dramatic than merchant ships operating at different speeds. Others preserve the distinct rhythm of fishing vessels, tugboats, or friendly escorts. Marine life enters the lessons as naturally as human machinery. Rainfall striking the ocean surface acquires its own recognizable texture. Wind roughens the water until entire frequencies disappear beneath continuous natural interference. At first, nearly everything blends together into an indistinct wash of noise. You remain beside them as the hours quietly accumulate, noticing how little changes from one session to the next. There are no dramatic breakthroughs, no single afternoon when uncertainty suddenly gives way to mastery. Instead, perception shifts so gradually that the students themselves may struggle to recognize their own progress. A recording played during the first week seems impossibly confusing. The same recording returned several weeks later reveals details that previously escaped notice entirely. Somewhere between those moments, hearing has begun to transform into disciplined observation. The instructors seldom describe this transformation as talent. They speak instead of habits. Listen longer before deciding. Compare one sound against another. Trust experience, but never allow familiarity to become certainty. Record what is known. Separate it carefully from what is merely suspected. Above all, Resist the temptation to hear what fear or hope wishes to find. The ocean has a quiet way of rewarding patience while exposing haste. Beyond the classroom, the war continues according to its own relentless timetable. Shipyards launch new escorts as quickly as industry permits. Merchant convoys gather in busy harbors before dispersing across oceans that seem almost impossibly vast. Newspapers print maps filled with arrows, sinking reports, and carefully measured optimism. Yet inside these training establishments, the pace remains strangely detached from headlines. The instructors understand that the next convoy will depend less upon dramatic courage than upon countless ordinary hours spent teaching young sailors how not to mistake imagination for evidence. The equipment itself reflects this philosophy. It is neither elegant nor theatrical. Large control dials require deliberate adjustment. Switches respond with reassuring mechanical resistance rather than effortless movement. Valves, transformers, amplifiers, and cables occupy their assigned places with industrial practicality. Every component has been designed to survive vibration, salt air, changing temperatures, and the constant motion of ships that may remain at sea for weeks without respite. Beauty has little place here. Reliability becomes its own quiet form of craftsmanship. As the days lengthen into weeks, another lesson emerges almost unnoticed. Listening is never an isolated act. The operator does not work apart from the ship but as one small part of a much larger organism. Engineers maintain engines whose vibrations become familiar reference points. Helmsmen alter course in response to reports from below. Signalmen relay information across the fleet. Officers weigh uncertain contacts against fuel reserves, convoy schedules, weather forecasts, and intelligence gathered far beyond the horizon. Even the most accurate echo acquires meaning only when it enters this wider network of human judgment. By the end of another ordinary training day, the headphones are carefully returned to their hooks, notebooks are closed, and instructors quietly extinguish the last indicator lamps before locking the compartment. Outside, evening settles over the harbor with remarkable indifference. Gulls continue circling above anchored ships. Dock workers finish loading cargo beneath fading light. Families walk home through nearby streets, unaware that inside one unremarkable building, dozens of young sailors have spent another day learning to hear a world that almost no one else realizes exists. The lesson has not yet taught them how to find an enemy. It has taught them something more fundamental. First, they must learn to hear the sea itself. The instructors sometimes begin with silence, although they know it is not truly silence at all. They ask the trainees to settle the headphones over their ears before any demonstration begins, allowing them to sit for several minutes without explanation. At first the room seems almost empty, interrupted only by the faint hum of electrical equipment and the distant vibration of the building itself. Then, as attention steadies, quieter layers begin to emerge. A chair shifts somewhere behind them. Heating pipes expand with a gentle metallic tick. Someone turns the page of a notebook. The exercise has little to do with the ocean and everything to do with expectation. Most people hear only what demands attention. A sonar operator must learn to notice what does not. When the recordings resume, they are rarely presented as puzzles waiting for clever answers. Instead, they resemble landscapes explored repeatedly from different directions. One morning a convoy passes slowly across the headphones, its escort vessels maintaining disciplined intervals while merchant engines beat with slightly different rhythms according to their age, size, and machinery. Later the same recording returns, but this time the instructor asks the class to ignore the louder sounds and concentrate instead upon the faint disturbances lingering beneath them. Nothing has changed within the recording itself. Only the listener is expected to change. This method requires unusual humility because progress cannot easily be measured from one day to the next. A marksman may count tighter groups upon a target. A navigator may calculate more accurate positions. The sonar trainee experiences improvement through subtler means. Where yesterday's listening produced only confusion, today's session yields a cautious distinction between two nearby propeller patterns. A low mechanical pulse, once mistaken for background noise, now reveals itself as a vessel moving steadily across open water. Confidence arrives not through certainty but through fewer unnecessary assumptions. Outside the classroom windows, the harbor contributes lessons of its own. Ships arrive bearing the marks of hard service. Their hulls carry fresh welds where damage has been repaired. Salt leaves pale streaks beneath hawse pipes and anchor chains. Crews disembark looking neither triumphant nor defeated, but simply tired in the quiet manner of people who have spent too many weeks measuring their days by watches rather than calendars. The trainees watch them without ceremony. They understand that before long they will occupy those same decks, entering routines that no amount of classroom instruction can completely reproduce. The instructors know this as well. For that reason, practical training moves gradually from recorded sounds to living ships. A vessel secured alongside the quay becomes another classroom, though one where every lesson now includes movement. The compartment gently sways beneath their feet even in sheltered water. Machinery no longer plays from carefully prepared recordings but surrounds them as a physical presence. Engines resonate through the deck plates, creating vibrations that travel upward through boots and knees before ever reaching the ears. The students begin to appreciate that listening aboard a warship involves the entire body. Balance, posture, breathing, and fatigue quietly influence perception long before anyone notices their effect. You observe them during these first voyages as they struggle against distractions that the experienced crew scarcely acknowledges. Cups rattle faintly against metal tables. Bulkheads answer each passing swell with familiar groans. Ventilation fans maintain their patient circulation of warm and cool air through narrow ducts. Somewhere forward, sailors secure loose equipment before changing course. None of these sounds indicate danger, yet every one demands recognition. Before an unfamiliar echo can stand apart, the familiar ones must become trusted companions rather than persistent interruptions. The sea itself proves an equally demanding teacher. On calm mornings the surface appears almost motionless, encouraging the illusion that conditions beneath it must be equally orderly. Then a weather front arrives during the afternoon, roughening the water until waves strike the hull with changing force while spray washes rhythmically across the bow. Inside the sonar compartment, the difference becomes immediately apparent. Sounds that seemed clear only hours earlier now drift in and out beneath layers of natural interference. The students begin to understand that the ocean is never merely the setting of their work. It is an active participant, altering the clarity of every observation according to conditions entirely beyond human control. Experienced operators seldom respond to these changes with frustration. Instead, they display a patience that younger sailors often mistake for indifference. They have learned that the sea owes no explanation for its behavior. There will be days when contacts seem almost impossibly distinct and others when uncertainty persists despite every careful adjustment. Neither circumstance should alter the discipline of observation. Each watch begins with the same measured attention, each report with the same cautious language, each conclusion balanced against the possibility that tomorrow's conditions may reveal something different. By the time the training vessel returns to harbor beneath the soft light of evening, the students carry away no dramatic stories to recount. No enemy has appeared. No alarms have sounded. Yet something meaningful has shifted all the same. The compartment that first seemed crowded with incomprehensible machinery has become a little more familiar. The endless collection of noises has begun to arrange itself into recognizable patterns. Most importantly, the young operators have started to abandon the comforting belief that the ocean will ever present clear answers on demand. Instead, they are learning to live comfortably beside uncertainty, trusting careful observation more than quick certainty. Soon, these lessons will leave the protected waters of the harbor. The same headphones, the same routines, and the same patient discipline will travel into oceans where unseen submarines wait beneath convoys crossing thousands of miles of open water. There, the difference between an ordinary sound and an extraordinary one may remain no more than the faintest alteration in a rhythm already half hidden by the sea itself. Watches without a horizon. Training ends quietly. There is no single morning when an instructor announces that listening has become instinct, nor an afternoon when uncertainty simply disappears beneath accumulated experience. Instead, one watch concludes, orders are received, kit is packed into canvas bags, and the young operator finds himself walking up the gangway of an escort vessel that already carries the smell of fuel oil, damp rope, fresh paint, and months of uninterrupted service. The transition from student to crew member happens with remarkably little ceremony. The sea has little interest in graduations. The ship itself has settled into habits long before its newest sailor arrives. Watches change according to a rhythm that scarcely notices individual faces. Meals appear from the galley with dependable regularity despite whether that rarely cooperates. Engineers descend into machinery spaces before dawn while signalmen study weather reports arriving over crackling wireless sets. Deck crews inspect lines, anchors, lifeboats, and anti-aircraft guns whose metal surfaces gather moisture during cool mornings before warming beneath the afternoon sun. Every department repeats its own cycle until the vessel functions less like a collection of specialists and more like a living organism sustained by countless routines that rarely demand recognition. The sonar compartment becomes one organ among many. It occupies neither the highest nor the lowest place within the ship's hierarchy, yet everyone understands its peculiar responsibility. Unlike the bridge, which surveys the visible world, this room concerns itself almost entirely with what cannot be seen. Reports rise from beneath the deck plates toward officers who may never hear the original sounds themselves. Decisions made in bright daylight often begin inside a compartment where daylight never enters. The operator quickly discovers that watches possess their own personality. A dawn watch feels different from one taken shortly after midnight, even when the duties remain unchanged. During the early hours before sunrise, the ship seems suspended between sleeping and waking. Footsteps remain subdued along passageways. Conversations are brief, spoken more from necessity than companionship. Somewhere above, the horizon gradually separates itself from the darkness, though none of that changing light reaches the headphones resting over attentive ears. Time is sensed indirectly through subtle changes in activity elsewhere aboard. You remain close enough to notice how attention settles rather than sharpens. Popular imagination often treats vigilance as an intensely focused state maintained without interruption, yet reality proves gentler and more disciplined. The experienced operator does not strain continuously against the silence. Such effort would become exhausting long before the watch reached its end. Instead, concentration expands and contracts with quiet flexibility, remaining alert without becoming rigid. It resembles the patient awareness of someone watching weather move across distant hills, never forcing significance upon every passing cloud. The convoy surrounding the escort rarely announces itself through spectacle. Merchant ships maintain their assigned stations with remarkable steadiness, each carrying cargo whose importance extends far beyond its individual destination. Grain, aviation fuel, medical supplies, machine tools, ammunition, clothing, spare engines, and thousands of other necessities travel together across immense distances. The vessels themselves appear ordinary enough, their decks crowded with cranes, ventilators, lifeboats, and cargo gear weathered by salt and constant exposure. Yet each represents months of industrial effort, countless civilian workers, and communities waiting across an ocean for deliveries that must arrive if the wider war is to continue. Protecting them requires an unusual acceptance of repetition. Day follows day with only gradual variations in weather and sea state. Bearings are checked. Positions recorded. Watches exchanged. Meals eaten. Equipment inspected. Small maintenance tasks quietly prevent larger failures. Nothing about the routine feels theatrical because the purpose of the escort lies precisely in preserving normality. A successful convoy is one whose ordinary progress remains uninterrupted. Inside the sonar compartment, this philosophy becomes almost physical. The headphones settle across familiar ears at the beginning of every watch with the same gentle pressure against the temples. Control dials receive minor adjustments as conditions change. Logbooks slowly fill with careful handwriting recording bearings, contacts, sea conditions, equipment checks, and observations that may appear almost repetitive to an outside reader. Yet repetition is not evidence that nothing is happening. It is evidence that discipline has been maintained. The ocean rarely offers complete stillness. Even during comparatively calm weather, layers of sound continue passing beneath the hull with quiet persistence. The escort's own propellers create a familiar mechanical heartbeat that experienced operators carry almost unconsciously in the background of their awareness. Other vessels contribute their own steady signatures according to distance and bearing. Somewhere farther away, another escort alters speed before gradually returning to formation. Rain begins as a faint hiss against the surface before strengthening into a broader texture that softens more distant sounds. Each alteration asks not for alarm but for recognition. Hours pass in this manner, and something subtle begins to happen to the perception of time itself. The operator no longer remembers individual minutes. Instead, the watch becomes a continuous landscape through which attention travels slowly, occasionally pausing upon some unfamiliar feature before resuming its patient course. Fatigue does not arrive dramatically. It settles gently upon the shoulders, encouraging shortcuts that experience has taught him to resist. A report delayed by only a few moments, an uncertain sound dismissed too quickly, or an assumption accepted without careful verification might remain inconsequential 100 times before becoming important on the 101st. So the discipline continues. Not because every watch contains danger, because no one knows which one will. Watches without a horizon. Days at sea begin to resemble one another so completely that memory occasionally arranges them into a single, continuous watch. Breakfast follows the same narrow passageways to the mess deck. Weather reports arrive with the same measured language, describing winds, pressure, visibility, and sea state with an almost comforting precision. Somewhere above, lookouts scan the horizon until their eyes begin unconsciously sorting clouds from ships and waves from distant smoke. Far below, the sonar operator settles once more before the familiar console, where the greatest change may be nothing more dramatic than a slightly rougher sea or an escort station altered by a few hundred yards. It is during these uneventful days that the discipline of listening quietly matures. Training had introduced the mechanics of observation, but routine transforms those lessons into instinct. The operator no longer thinks consciously about every adjustment of the equipment. Fingers find the correct controls without searching. Headphones settle into exactly the same position each watch. Notes are written with an economy of movement that comes only through repetition. Freed from these smaller decisions, the mind gains room for something more important, sustained attention that neither wanders nor forces itself. The ship, 2. Develops a recognizable rhythm beneath the feet of its crew. Experienced sailors often remark that they can tell when an engine is working differently long before any gauge confirms it. The difference may be almost imperceptible to a visitor, a slight alteration in vibration passing through the deck plates, a subtle hesitation before revolutions stabilize again, but for those who live aboard, familiarity sharpens perception. The sonar operator depends upon this intimate knowledge because the ship's own voice forms the foundation against which every unfamiliar sound must be judged. Before another vessel can be recognized, one's own vessel must become almost invisible to the mind. You notice how rarely anyone speaks inside the compartment. Silence here is not enforced by discipline alone but by necessity. Conversation competes with concentration, and concentration is already shared among countless overlapping sounds arriving through the headphones. When words are exchanged, they tend to remain practical and carefully measured. Bearings are confirmed. Equipment checks acknowledged. A contact, however uncertain, is quietly reported. Then the room settles once more into its familiar partnership between machinery and attentive listening. Outside, the convoy continues its patient progress across waters that seem incapable of ending. From the bridge, the merchant ships appear reassuringly steady, each maintaining its assigned place despite changing weather and the enormous distances involved. Their predictability becomes a source of comfort. A freighter seen off the port quarter during the morning remains there through the afternoon, rising and falling gently with the sea. Another holds position near the horizon, occasionally disappearing behind heavier swells before returning exactly where expected. The geometry of the convoy creates an illusion of permanence, as though nothing beyond its ordered formation could possibly intrude. Yet everyone aboard understands that this order exists only because countless small acts sustain it. Engineers inspect pumps before they fail. Cooks prepare meals regardless of weather. Signalmen repeat messages until they are correctly received. Quartermasters maintain headings despite shifting winds and currents. The sonar operator contributes by continuing to listen even when every previous hour has yielded nothing worthy of immediate concern. Routine is not the absence of danger. It is the method by which danger is kept from becoming catastrophe. Weather steadily reshapes that routine without ever completely interrupting it. A calm sea carries distant machinery with remarkable clarity, allowing familiar contacts to linger across surprising distances. Then an Atlantic depression arrives, and the escort begins climbing larger swells whose impact sends fresh vibrations throughout the hull. Rain spreads across the surface until the water itself acquires a continuous whisper beneath the headphones. Wind presses against the superstructure with enough force to alter the ship's motion. None of these changes suspend the watch. They simply require the operator to begin listening through a different sea than the one encountered yesterday. This constant adaptation produces a quiet mental discipline that few people beyond the compartment fully appreciate. The operator must remain neither optimistic nor pessimistic about what he hears. Hope can be as misleading as fear. After several uneventful crossings, the temptation naturally arises to interpret uncertain sounds as harmless because they almost always prove to be so. Yet experience teaches another lesson entirely. The ocean does not become safer simply because it has been quiet. It remains indifferent, preserving the same capacity for concealment whether the last contact occurred yesterday or several months before. Hours continue passing with remarkable gentleness. Watches change. Fresh mugs of tea replace empty ones. Logbooks accumulate another page of neat handwriting. The convoy steams onward beneath shifting skies whose colors change far more dramatically than anything inside the sonar compartment. To an outside observer, it might appear that almost nothing has happened. In truth, something important has happened every hour. The habit of careful listening has survived another watch without becoming careless. That quiet success is precisely what allows the convoy to keep moving westward, mile after unremarkable mile, through an ocean where the most dangerous presence is often the one that remains completely unseen. Echoes that refuse to explain themselves. The first uncertain contact rarely announces itself with the clarity imagined in peacetime illustrations. It arrives quietly, almost apologetically, interrupting an otherwise ordinary watch with something so faint that the operator hesitates before giving it a name. Nothing dramatic changes inside the compartment. No alarm immediately rings throughout the ship. The engines continue their steady revolutions. Somewhere above, sailors carry on with maintenance that has occupied their morning since sunrise. The convoy remains arranged upon the sea with the same careful order it possessed only moments before. Yet beneath the headphones, a pattern has appeared that does not quite belong among the familiar voices already filling the water. The greatest temptation is not to report too little. It is to report too much. Every operator understands this long before experiencing it firsthand. Months of training have emphasized the danger of certainty reached too quickly. The sea has an extraordinary talent for producing convincing illusions. Layers of colder and warmer water bend sound in unexpected directions. Waves scatter echoes into unfamiliar shapes. Merchant vessels occasionally generate harmonics that seem detached from their true position. Even the escort's own machinery can create reflections that momentarily resemble something external. The responsibility of the listener is not merely to hear unusual sounds, but to protect the ship from unnecessary confidence. The headphones remain perfectly still against the sides of his head while the mind behind them becomes intensely active. A bearing is noted. The signal lingers, then weakens almost beyond recognition. A careful adjustment of the equipment changes its character without fully explaining it. It returns a few moments later, though not quite where memory expected it to appear. Each observation adds another fragment to an unfinished picture whose outline remains stubbornly incomplete. You observe the operator resist the instinct to force those fragments together. That restraint may be the least visible skill developed during years of service. Human perception naturally seeks recognizable patterns. It prefers complete stories over uncertain pieces, conclusions over possibilities. Yet beneath the ocean, premature certainty can prove more dangerous than honest ambiguity. A phantom contact pursued with conviction may pull an escort away from the very convoy it has been entrusted to protect. Hours of fuel, attention, and tactical advantage may quietly disappear into the pursuit of something that never existed outside imperfect interpretation. The report passed to the bridge reflects this discipline. Its language remains deliberately measured. There is no theatrical declaration of an enemy submarine waiting below. Instead, the officer of the watch receives information accompanied by uncertainty rather than concealed beneath false confidence. Possible contact. Bearing observed. Intermittent signal. Investigation recommended. Such phrases lack the dramatic certainty often associated with wartime decisions, yet they represent the vocabulary upon which responsible command depends. Above, the bridge absorbs the report without visible excitement. Officers lean over charts already crowded with convoy positions, estimated courses, weather information, and navigation notes accumulated throughout the voyage. A single uncertain contact enters a larger conversation involving fuel consumption, daylight remaining, escort disposition, wireless intelligence, sea conditions, and the simple reality that protecting dozens of merchant ships demands caution against both genuine threats and costly distractions. The sonar operator has offered one carefully observed piece of evidence. Others must now determine how that evidence fits within a far broader picture. Below, The listening continues uninterrupted. That continuity surprises many newcomers. They imagine that uncertainty naturally gives way to decisive action, yet the opposite often proves true. The initial report marks not the end of observation but its beginning. Every subsequent minute matters because the sea is constantly changing. The contact may strengthen. It may disappear altogether. Another bearing may emerge that supports the first impression or quietly contradicts it. Information gains value through persistence rather than immediacy. The compartment itself seems to recognize this change in atmosphere without altering its outward appearance. The same indicator lamps glow softly across familiar panels. Pens continue moving across logbooks. Hands rest lightly upon well-worn controls whose smooth surfaces bear the touch of countless previous watches. Only the quality of attention has shifted. Routine has narrowed into careful concentration, not through visible urgency but through the quiet understanding that every new sound now carries slightly greater significance than the last. Outside, clouds drift steadily across an Atlantic sky that reveals nothing of the conversation unfolding beneath the waves. Gulls occasionally appear when land lies somewhere beyond the horizon, though often none are seen for days at a time. Swells continue lifting the escort with patient regularity. Merchant vessels maintain formation as faithfully as before. From their decks, little seems different. Sailors secure cargo gear, inspect lifeboats, chip rust from exposed fittings, and write letters during moments of leisure. The ordinary life of the convoy continues because it must. Only a handful of people know that somewhere beneath the ocean, an unanswered question has begun moving quietly alongside them. For now, it is nothing more than a sound. Whether it becomes history depends upon what the next few minutes choose to reveal. Minutes pass with a peculiar elasticity known only to people whose work depends upon uncertainty. A quarter of an hour may contain almost no outward movement, yet within the headphones each passing second introduces another opportunity for the sea to alter its answer. The operator resists the temptation to fill that waiting with expectation. He has learned that anticipation possesses its own acoustic signature, one capable of persuading tired minds that they hear confirmation where only possibility exists. Experience encourages a quieter discipline. Allow the sound to become whatever it already is before deciding what it might mean. The contact returns, though not quite in the manner memory had preserved it. It arrives fractionally stronger, then fades beneath the escort's own machinery before reappearing at a slightly altered bearing. Such behavior refuses simple explanation. A submarine changing course could produce similar variation. So might unusual temperature layers beneath the surface. Another escort maneuvering many miles away could distort familiar echoes in ways that seem strangely convincing. The sea offers several plausible stories at once, leaving the operator with the difficult task of describing observations rather than selecting the most satisfying narrative. This habit of disciplined restraint gradually shapes relationships throughout the ship. Officers come to know which reports deserve immediate attention not because they contain dramatic language but because they are delivered without unnecessary certainty. Trust accumulates quietly. An operator who admits doubt when doubt genuinely exists becomes more convincing on the rare occasions when confidence finally replaces hesitation. Such credibility cannot be manufactured during moments of crisis. It is earned through countless ordinary watches in which careful judgment repeatedly outweighs personal pride. You begin to notice how responsibility spreads gently through the vessel instead of resting upon a single individual. The operator listens. A petty officer compares present observations with earlier entries recorded in the log. The bridge weighs those reports against convoy movements and intelligence summaries received before departure. The commanding officer considers whether altering course might expose another section of the formation. Engineers stand ready should greater speed become necessary. Gunnery crews remain unaware of the discussion entirely, continuing routine maintenance while the invisible conversation beneath the sea slowly develops. Decisions emerge not from isolated certainty but from many partial understandings brought patiently together. Outside, the weather contributes another voice to the debate. Wind freshens steadily through the afternoon, roughening the sea until white foam begins appearing along the crests of larger swells. Rain follows in scattered bands that briefly reduce visibility before moving eastward again. Inside the sonar compartment, these changing conditions possess consequences invisible to anyone watching from the bridge. Surface agitation introduces fresh layers of interference that gently blur distant sounds without erasing them altogether. The operator responds not with frustration but with adaptation, adjusting equipment carefully while accepting that some questions cannot be answered as clearly today as they might have been yesterday. Hours earlier, the watch had unfolded according to familiar routine. Now routine itself has acquired additional weight. Every entry written into the logbook may later help explain a pattern that remains invisible in the present moment. Bearings separated by only a few degrees begin forming cautious sequences across the page. Time intervals reveal their own subtle rhythm. A sound dismissed in isolation may gain importance when viewed alongside several similar observations made over the course of an afternoon. Documentation becomes another form of listening, preserving fragile impressions before memory quietly reshapes them. The emotional burden remains surprisingly restrained. Contrary to popular imagination, there is rarely a dramatic rush of fear sweeping through the compartment. More often there is concentration accompanied by an almost deliberate calm. The men understand that anxiety contributes nothing useful to interpretation. Elevated emotion narrows perception precisely when perception must remain broad. Their task is not to imagine danger but to observe faithfully until evidence allows danger to identify itself. Beyond the hull, life beneath the ocean continues with complete indifference to human uncertainty. Schools of fish move through darker water according to instincts older than recorded history. Cold currents descend while warmer layers rise, carrying sounds along paths invisible to every chart spread across the bridge. Somewhere in that immense underwater landscape, a submarine may indeed be altering course with equal patience, its own crew listening through different instruments toward the escort above. Or perhaps there is no submarine at all, only an ocean reminding both hunter and guardian that certainty is a luxury seldom granted beneath its surface. As evening approaches, the contact slowly weakens until it becomes indistinguishable from the countless other sounds inhabiting the sea. No triumphant conclusion follows its disappearance. No officer confidently declares that danger has passed. Instead, another careful notation enters the logbook, recording not victory or failure but observation honestly completed. The uncertainty remains unresolved, yet the discipline of the watch has not faltered. In that quiet fidelity lies the true achievement of the day. Tomorrow the headphones will be lifted once more. The sea will speak again. Whether it offers clarity or another unanswered echo is entirely its own decision. Minutes pass with a peculiar elasticity known only to people whose work depends upon uncertainty. A quarter of an hour may contain almost no outward movement, yet within the headphones each passing second introduces another opportunity for the sea to alter its answer. The operator resists the temptation to fill that waiting with expectation. He has learned that anticipation possesses its own acoustic signature, one capable of persuading tired minds that they hear confirmation where only possibility exists. Experience encourages a quieter discipline. Allow the sound to become whatever it already is before deciding what it might mean. The contact returns, though not quite in the manner memory had preserved it. It arrives fractionally stronger, then fades beneath the escort's own machinery before reappearing at a slightly altered bearing. Such behavior refuses simple explanation. A submarine changing course could produce similar variation. So might unusual temperature layers beneath the surface. Another escort maneuvering many miles away could distort familiar echoes in ways that seem strangely convincing. The sea offers several plausible stories at once, leaving the operator with the difficult task of describing observations rather than selecting the most satisfying narrative. This habit of disciplined restraint gradually shapes relationships throughout the ship. Officers come to know which reports deserve immediate attention not because they contain dramatic language but because they are delivered without unnecessary certainty. Trust accumulates quietly. An operator who admits doubt when doubt genuinely exists becomes more convincing on the rare occasions when confidence finally replaces hesitation. Such credibility cannot be manufactured during moments of crisis. It is earned through countless ordinary watches in which careful judgment repeatedly outweighs personal pride. You begin to notice how responsibility spreads gently through the vessel instead of resting upon a single individual. The operator listens. A petty officer compares present observations with earlier entries recorded in the log. The bridge weighs those reports against convoy movements and intelligence summaries received before departure. The commanding officer considers whether altering course might expose another section of the formation. Engineers stand ready should greater speed become necessary. Gunnery crews remain unaware of the discussion entirely, continuing routine maintenance while the invisible conversation beneath the sea slowly develops. Decisions emerge not from isolated certainty but from many partial understandings brought patiently together. Outside, the weather contributes another voice to the debate. Wind freshens steadily through the afternoon, roughening the sea until white foam begins appearing along the crests of larger swells. Rain follows in scattered bands that briefly reduce visibility before moving eastward again. Inside the sonar compartment, these changing conditions possess consequences invisible to anyone watching from the bridge. Surface agitation introduces fresh layers of interference that gently blur distant sounds without erasing them altogether. The operator responds not with frustration but with adaptation, adjusting equipment carefully while accepting that some questions cannot be answered as clearly today as they might have been yesterday. Hours earlier, the watch had unfolded according to familiar routine. Now routine itself has acquired additional weight. Every entry written into the logbook may later help explain a pattern that remains invisible in the present moment. Bearings separated by only a few degrees begin forming cautious sequences across the page. Time intervals reveal their own subtle rhythm. A sound dismissed in isolation may gain importance when viewed alongside several similar observations made over the course of an afternoon. Documentation becomes another form of listening, preserving fragile impressions before memory quietly reshapes them. The emotional burden remains surprisingly restrained. Contrary to popular imagination, there is rarely a dramatic rush of fear sweeping through the compartment. More often there is concentration accompanied by an almost deliberate calm. The men understand that anxiety contributes nothing useful to interpretation. Elevated emotion narrows perception precisely when perception must remain broad. Their task is not to imagine danger but to observe faithfully until evidence allows danger to identify itself. Beyond the hull, life beneath the ocean continues with complete indifference to human uncertainty. Schools of fish move through darker water according to instincts older than recorded history. Cold currents descend while warmer layers rise, carrying sounds along paths invisible to every chart spread across the bridge. Somewhere in that immense underwater landscape, a submarine may indeed be altering course with equal patience, its own crew listening through different instruments toward the escort above. Or perhaps there is no submarine at all, only an ocean reminding both hunter and guardian that certainty is a luxury seldom granted beneath its surface. As evening approaches, The contact slowly weakens until it becomes indistinguishable from the countless other sounds inhabiting the sea. No triumphant conclusion follows its disappearance. No officer confidently declares that danger has passed. Instead, another careful notation enters the logbook, recording not victory or failure but observation honestly completed. The uncertainty remains unresolved, yet the discipline of the watch has not faltered. In that quiet fidelity lies the true achievement of the day. Tomorrow the headphones will be lifted once more. The sea will speak again. Whether it offers clarity or another unanswered echo is entirely its own decision. Morning arrives beneath a ceiling of low cloud that seems to press the sea and sky closer together than usual. Visibility shortens until the horizon dissolves into pale grey distance, leaving the convoy suspended inside a world whose boundaries have become difficult to define. The merchant ships remain where they should be, though each appears softer around the edges, emerging from mist before gradually fading into it again. The weather has changed only modestly, yet everyone aboard senses that familiar routines will now be carried out beneath different conditions than yesterday. Inside the sonar compartment, the beginning of another watch follows its customary order. Equipment inspections remain unhurried. Connections are checked with practiced hands. The previous watch's logbook entries are reviewed before fresh pages are opened. The operator notices the final observations recorded during the evening. Intermittent contact, gradually weakening, lost without confirmation. No attempt has been made to force certainty upon the record. The unanswered question has simply been handed from one watch to the next, carried forward with the same care as every other responsibility aboard the ship. This quiet continuity reflects something fundamental about convoy warfare. Danger does not conveniently arrange itself around the boundaries of human schedules. Watches end because sailors require sleep, not because the ocean has concluded its work. Every incoming operator inherits both the physical environment and the accumulated uncertainty left by those before him. The sea remembers nothing of yesterday's fatigue. It simply continues speaking in its own patient language. You watch the new operator settle into the familiar chair with the measured confidence of someone accepting another link in an unbroken chain rather than beginning a fresh story. He does not attempt to relive the previous watch's observations. Instead, he absorbs them carefully before allowing his own listening to begin. The distinction is subtle but important. Memory provides context, never replacement. Every sound must still earn its own interpretation. The convoy advances steadily through weather that favors concealment. From the bridge, officers periodically lose sight of ships near the outer edges of the formation before they quietly emerge once again from drifting curtains of mist. Wireless reports arrive with routine efficiency, describing conditions experienced by neighboring escorts whose own visibility has changed in similar ways. Nothing in these reports suggests immediate danger, yet everyone recognizes that weather affects more than navigation. It alters perception itself. Lookouts rely more heavily upon sound than sight. Signal lamps become less useful than radio. Beneath the water, shifting conditions subtly reshape how echoes travel through layers of differing temperature and density. The sonar equipment does not announce these changes dramatically. Instead, familiar sounds acquire slightly altered textures. Propeller beats seem to arrive with less consistency than before. Distant contacts fade more quickly into the surrounding background. At times the escort's own mechanical voice appears unusually prominent, as though the sea has drawn nearby sounds closer while gently pushing everything else beyond reach. None of these changes surprises the experienced operator. Every voyage teaches again that listening never occurs under identical conditions twice. Hours pass before anything unfamiliar interrupts the routine. This time the sound arrives with greater confidence than the uncertain echo of the previous day. It remains faint, yet its rhythm possesses a steadiness that immediately distinguishes it from random interference. The operator does not react outwardly. His breathing remains even. His pencil continues resting lightly above the logbook without immediately touching the paper. Experience has taught him that the first impression deserves attention, but never obedience. He listens once, then again. The bearing remains almost unchanged. Only after several careful observations does the pencil begin moving across the page. The report passed upward is still cautious, but its language has shifted almost imperceptibly. No certainty is claimed. Yet fewer qualifying words are needed than yesterday. The contact has demonstrated consistency. It has behaved less like scattered noise and more like an object maintaining its own relationship with the escort's movement. The distinction may appear slight to an outsider. Within the quiet vocabulary of sonar reporting, it represents meaningful progress. On the bridge, the officer of the watch receives the information without haste. Charts already crowded with bearings now gain another carefully drawn notation. The commanding officer studies it alongside convoy formation, estimated submarine operating areas, prevailing weather, and the reports arriving from neighboring escorts. No single piece of information commands the decision before him. Instead, each contributes another fragment toward a picture that remains incomplete despite growing clearer with every passing minute. This is the peculiar nature of command at sea. Rarely does anyone possess enough information to remove doubt entirely. Instead, responsibility consists of deciding when enough uncertainty has quietly become sufficient evidence for action. The ship continues forward, its wake disappearing almost immediately into the grey Atlantic behind it, while beneath the surface an unseen conversation grows slowly more distinct. No bell announces the moment when observation begins to influence action. The transition is almost invisible, revealed not through dramatic orders but through small adjustments that ripple gently through the routines of the ship. A signalman receives a brief instruction and quietly acknowledges it before returning to his instruments. The helmsman is given a modest alteration of course measured in only a few degrees. Engine room telegraphs remain nearly unchanged, yet engineers below notice a subtle request for steadier revolutions. Nothing aboard suggests panic. Instead, the vessel behaves like an experienced craftsman making careful corrections before imperfections become obvious. Within the sonar compartment, these changes introduce an entirely new layer of interpretation. Every alteration in course changes the geometry through which sound reaches the hull. A contact that previously seemed stationary may now drift slowly across the operator's listening field. Another echo grows unexpectedly weaker, not because it has disappeared, but because the relationship between ship and sea has quietly changed. The operator must therefore distinguish between changes produced by the ocean and those produced by his own vessel. Listening has become inseparable from movement. You remain beside him long enough to appreciate how many questions now accompany every answer. If the bearing shifts, is the contact maneuvering or has the escort's turn created the illusion of movement? If the signal strengthens, has the distance genuinely narrowed or have the changing water layers simply carried the sound more efficiently? Each observation acquires meaning only when compared with the ones preceding it. A single moment rarely speaks clearly. Time itself becomes another instrument. The bridge understands this dependence upon continuity. Officers do not demand certainty where certainty cannot honestly be given. Instead, they ask quieter questions. Is the bearing remaining stable? Has the character of the sound altered? Does it correspond with previous reports? Could the weather explain the difference? Such conversations rarely leave the wardroom or the bridge, yet they shape the conduct of entire convoys. A destroyer does not protect merchant ships by charging toward every unexplained echo. It protects them by allowing disciplined observation to mature before committing precious time, fuel, and position. Meanwhile, life elsewhere aboard proceeds with remarkable steadiness. The cook continues preparing the midday meal in a galley that rises and falls gently with the swell. A mechanic wipes oil from a familiar valve before checking another farther along the engine room. Sailors on deck tighten lashings loosened by damp weather while others scrape corrosion from railings already beginning to show the effects of salt and wind. Letters are reread during brief moments of rest. Boots are dried beside warm pipes. Blankets are folded with habitual care after another night spent in narrow bunks. The ordinary routines of shipboard life persist because they must. If every uncertain report disrupted them, the voyage would soon become impossible. The weather, however, refuses to remain constant. By afternoon, the wind eases almost as gradually as it had strengthened the day before. The sea still rolls beneath the convoy, but its surface begins to smooth between the larger swells. Rain withdraws toward the eastern horizon, leaving behind a quieter atmosphere in which distant sounds once again travel with greater confidence. The operator notices the difference almost immediately. Familiar contacts regain their sharper outlines. The escort's own machinery settles back into its accustomed place within the acoustic landscape. The sea has not become generous, only slightly less reluctant. Against this calmer background, the uncertain contact reveals another fragment of itself. Its rhythm persists. It neither wanders aimlessly nor dissolves into random interference. Yet it also refuses to become the unmistakable signature everyone secretly hopes for. The operator recognizes the temptation growing within him. After hours of careful listening, the mind naturally longs for conclusion. A clear answer would relieve the burden of constant interpretation. Experience, however, offers a quieter lesson. Many watches end without granting that satisfaction. The report forwarded to the bridge reflects this mature restraint. Confidence has increased, but so has precision. Bearings are narrower. Timing is more exact. Descriptions avoid embellishment while becoming steadily more useful. The information now carries sufficient consistency that neighboring escorts are quietly informed, not because danger has been confirmed, but because responsible seamanship requires shared awareness long before certainty arrives. Across the convoy, other operators settle more carefully into their own watches, adding fresh ears to an investigation that remains largely invisible to everyone outside the escort screen. As evening approaches, the convoy continues westward beneath a sky where breaks in the cloud allow muted sunlight to spread across the Atlantic in long silver bands. From a distance, the formation appears almost peaceful, merchant ships maintaining their measured intervals while escorts weave patient patterns around them. Nothing about the scene suggests the invisible calculations unfolding beneath the surface. Yet inside several dimly lit compartments scattered across the convoy, men continue listening with unwavering discipline, each adding another careful observation to a picture that still refuses to become complete. The sea has yielded more evidence than yesterday. It has not yet yielded certainty. And so the watches continue, not because the mystery demands excitement, but because endurance remains the truest companion of those who spend their lives listening for an enemy they cannot see. The weight of invisible responsibility. There comes a point during every long voyage when uncertainty itself begins to acquire weight. Not because the evidence has become overwhelming, but because it has remained unresolved for so long that everyone responsible for interpreting it must now carry its consequences. The contact has persisted across watches, weather, and changing crews. It has neither declared itself openly nor disappeared into harmless coincidence. Instead, It occupies an uncomfortable place between possibility and conviction, asking each new watch to begin where the previous one ended rather than allowing the story to start anew. The convoy has now been at sea long enough that routine has settled deeply into every department aboard the escort. Faces have grown more familiar than calendars. Meals arrive according to watches rather than dates. Clothing carries the permanent scent of salt, machinery, and enclosed living spaces. Even the motion of the ship no longer demands conscious adjustment. Newcomers brace themselves instinctively against the sea. Veterans simply move with it. Within the sonar compartment, this quiet adaptation produces an unexpected danger. Familiarity. The operator understands that the greatest threat to disciplined listening is not always fear. Often it is comfort. The machinery has behaved reliably for days. The convoy has maintained formation. Hundreds of routine observations have required nothing beyond careful notation before dissolving harmlessly into the growing pages of the logbook. Such consistency encourages the mind to predict tomorrow from yesterday, quietly reducing vigilance without announcing that it has done so. Training had warned against this long before the first voyage. Routine protects discipline. Routine can also conceal complacency. You watch as the incoming operator studies several pages of accumulated reports before beginning his own watch. The handwriting changes from one sailor to another, yet the language remains remarkably consistent. Bearings. Sea state. Equipment performance. Contact intermittent. Contact reacquired. Contact uncertain. Every entry reflects the same deliberate caution that has characterized the voyage from its beginning. Reading these pages resembles walking through another person's memory, each observation preserved exactly as it was experienced, free from the temptation to reshape it after later events become known. Outside, the Atlantic continues its endless conversation with the convoy. Morning sunlight briefly escapes through broken cloud before another weather system gradually softens the light again. Flying fish occasionally disturb calmer waters farther south, while northern crossings bring seabirds that follow the ships for hours before vanishing beyond the horizon. During colder passages, spray freezes upon exposed railings until sailors carefully chip away the accumulating ice. Elsewhere, warmer currents leave damp air lingering inside passageways long after sunset. Every voyage writes its own physical history upon the ship, layer by patient layer. The sonar operator rarely enjoys the luxury of observing these changing landscapes directly. His understanding of weather often arrives through sound before sight. Heavy seas announce themselves beneath the headphones long before someone descending from the bridge mentions deteriorating conditions. Rain possesses a distinct texture against the ocean surface. Strong winds alter both the ship's movement and the countless natural sounds surrounding it. Even distant ice fields sometimes contribute subtle acoustic reflections unlike anything encountered in temperate waters. The compartment remains enclosed, yet the entire ocean quietly enters it through vibration. This growing intimacy with invisible environments gradually changes the operator's relationship with the world beyond the hull. A merchant vessel passing several thousand yards away is no longer merely a silhouette upon the horizon. It possesses an acoustic character assembled from engines, propellers, loading condition, and speed. Without consciously intending to do so, experienced listeners begin recognizing familiar escorts almost as one might recognize old friends by the sound of approaching footsteps. The sea becomes populated not only by visible ships but by remembered voices traveling patiently beneath the surface. Responsibility deepens alongside this perception. The operator understands that his reports influence people he may never meet. Merchant captains adjust courses because escorts quietly reposition around them. Convoy commodores make decisions affecting dozens of civilian crews whose only awareness of danger may consist of seeing a destroyer unexpectedly alter speed. Hundreds of sailors, engineers, radio operators, cooks, stewards, and merchant seamen continue their ordinary duties while depending upon information originating inside a compartment hidden several decks below the waterline. Most will never know the names of those providing it. Such anonymity becomes one of the defining characteristics of the work. Victories are rarely visible. Mistakes may never be fully understood. Only the discipline itself remains constant. As another watch settles into its familiar rhythm, the contact returns once again. Not dramatically. Simply persistently. Like a question the ocean has quietly decided is not yet finished asking. The returning signal does not sound louder than before. If anything, its restraint makes it more difficult to dismiss. It occupies the same uncertain territory between familiarity and doubt that has accompanied the convoy for several days, appearing long enough to invite careful attention before withdrawing again into the broader conversation of the sea. The operator has learned not to measure significance by volume alone. Some of the clearest sounds prove entirely harmless, while others scarcely rise above the surrounding water before quietly changing the course of an entire voyage. He begins, as always, by refusing to hurry. The bearing is compared against previous entries rather than trusted in isolation. Equipment settings are checked before conclusions are drawn. The possibility of self-generated interference is considered first, not because it is the most interesting explanation, but because it is often the most responsible one. This habit reflects a broader philosophy that extends well beyond the sonar compartment. Throughout the escort, experienced sailors learn to eliminate ordinary causes before embracing extraordinary ones. Reliability depends less upon dramatic insight than upon disciplined skepticism. You notice how fatigue subtly alters this process. It does not necessarily make the operator careless. More often, it encourages efficiency where patience is required. After many consecutive watches, the mind begins searching for familiar conclusions that demand the least effort. An ambiguous sound resembles yesterday's contact, therefore perhaps it deserves yesterday's explanation. Such thinking offers welcome relief to an exhausted brain, yet it also threatens the careful neutrality upon which accurate observation depends. The most experienced listeners become students of their own limitations, recognizing tiredness not as weakness but as another condition requiring quiet management. Elsewhere aboard, similar forms of fatigue accumulate without announcing themselves. Engineers have spent weeks surrounded by heat, vibration, and the steady labor of keeping machinery dependable despite continuous operation. Lookouts continue scanning horizons that often reward hours of concentration with nothing more remarkable than changing cloud formations or distant seabirds. Cooks prepare meals according to routines that rarely vary, even when heavy seas send utensils sliding across galley tables. Every department carries its own version of repetition, and together those repetitions sustain the convoy far more effectively than occasional moments of visible excitement. The weather now begins another slow transformation. During the afternoon, the clouds gradually lift, allowing broader stretches of pale sunlight to reach the water. Visibility improves until merchant ships once hidden by mist recover their sharper outlines against the horizon. The sea itself remains restless, but its surface no longer scatters sound with quite the same persistence. Inside the compartment, familiar acoustic landmarks return with renewed clarity. The operator can once again distinguish individual escorts with greater confidence, while the convoy's merchant vessels arrange themselves into recognizable patterns beneath the headphones as naturally as they do across the ocean above. Against this clearer background, the persistent contact reveals a subtle consistency that had previously remained concealed. It does not simply exist, it behaves. The intervals between its strongest appearances begin aligning with estimates recorded over several earlier watches. Its bearing changes gradually rather than randomly. Nothing about these observations proves the existence of a submarine beyond doubt, yet together they suggest purpose rather than accident. Like scattered pieces of a chart slowly fitting together, each fragment gains meaning through its relationship with the others. The bridge receives these developing reports with the same restrained professionalism that has characterized the voyage from its beginning. Officers gather not because certainty has finally arrived, but because accumulated probability deserves careful consideration. Charts become crowded with pencil marks tracing estimated movements that remain deliberately tentative. One officer quietly compares present bearings with intelligence briefings received before departure. Another studies convoy spacing, considering how small adjustments might strengthen protection without unnecessarily disrupting progress. The discussion remains calm because haste offers no advantage. Every decision must balance the invisible possibility beneath the water against the visible responsibility surrounding it. You begin to understand that command, like listening, is fundamentally an exercise in living with incomplete knowledge. Neither the operator nor the captain enjoys the privilege of seeing the entire picture. Both must act responsibly while accepting that important pieces remain hidden beyond perception. The temptation to wait for perfect certainty is almost as dangerous as the temptation to abandon caution entirely. Somewhere between those extremes lies the quiet judgment upon which convoys survive. Evening settles gently across the Atlantic. The sunlight, weakened by distance and cloud, stretches long reflections across the rolling water before gradually surrendering to dusk. Lamps begin glowing aboard the merchant ships with careful discipline, their visibility controlled according to wartime necessity. Beneath the decks, another watch prepares to relieve the men who have spent hours following a sound that still refuses to reveal its true identity. Fresh hands reach for familiar headphones. New pages wait within the logbook. The conversation between sea and ship continues without interruption, passing from one listener to the next as naturally as the ocean passes beneath the keel. The contact has become more persuasive. It has not become certain. And in that narrow space between evidence and conviction, the real burden of the sonar operator quietly resides. When listening becomes action. There are mornings when the sea seems almost generous. The wind has eased during the night, leaving long, measured swells that lift the convoy with patient regularity instead of restless violence. Clouds remain scattered across the sky, allowing pale sunlight to drift across the Atlantic without fully warming it. Visibility extends for miles in every direction. Merchant ships once hidden by weather now occupy their familiar places with reassuring clarity, each maintaining its careful interval within the broad geometry of the convoy. To anyone standing upon the bridge, the ocean appears composed, almost cooperative. Below the waterline, the impression is more complicated. Calmer seas remove some forms of interference while revealing others that rough weather had quietly concealed. Sound travels differently through settled water. Familiar contacts become more sharply defined, yet distant echoes also acquire greater persistence, lingering beneath the headphones with unusual patience before fading away. The operator quickly realizes that improved conditions do not simplify his work. They merely present a different version of the same challenge. The watch begins as dozens before it have begun. Equipment is checked. Logbooks reviewed. Headphones adjusted. The first half hour produces nothing unexpected beyond the convoy's familiar acoustic landscape. Merchant engines continue their dependable rhythm. Escort vessels weave gradual patterns around the formation, their movements reflected in subtle changes of bearing already anticipated through long experience. Somewhere far away, another ship crosses an unseen section of the ocean, its machinery arriving only as a faint suggestion before disappearing once more beneath the broader conversation of sea and steel. Then something changes. Not suddenly. Precisely. The contact that has accompanied the convoy through previous days returns with a steadiness unlike any earlier appearance. Instead of emerging briefly before dissolving into uncertainty, it remains. Its rhythm neither wanders nor fragments. Successive observations reinforce rather than contradict one another. Small corrections to the equipment leave its character essentially unchanged. The operator has encountered many uncertain sounds during his service, but uncertainty itself possesses recognizable habits. This signal no longer behaves like hesitation. Even now, discipline refuses excitement. The report forwarded to the bridge contains no dramatic language, only careful precision. Bearing confirmed. Contact maintaining consistency. Strength increasing gradually. Further observation recommended. Each sentence remains restrained because credibility depends upon restraint. The operator understands that confidence expressed too early weakens every report that follows. If certainty is finally approaching, it must arrive through evidence rather than emotion. You observe the atmosphere aboard the escort alter almost imperceptibly. No one runs. Orders remain measured. Conversations grow slightly shorter without becoming hurried. The bridge acknowledges the report and quietly requests additional bearings. Another escort receives information through wireless communication phrased with equal caution. The convoy itself continues ahead, apparently unchanged, while the protective screen surrounding it begins making adjustments so modest that merchant crews may never notice them. This is how many important wartime decisions actually unfolded. Not through dramatic commands echoing across the decks, but through a succession of disciplined observations gradually becoming persuasive enough that responsible people could no longer ignore them. Inside the sonar compartment, time contracts. The operator is no longer simply recording the sea. He is now participating in a conversation extending throughout the ship. Every new bearing contributes to decisions unfolding several decks above. Every slight alteration in the contact's character becomes another piece of evidence entering discussions on the bridge. His work remains physically unchanged, listening, comparing, recording, but its consequences have expanded beyond the compartment itself. The contact begins moving across successive bearings with quiet consistency. Not randomly. Purposefully. Whether that purpose belongs to a submarine maneuvering beneath the convoy or another explanation still hidden within the sea cannot yet be stated with certainty. But for the first time since leaving harbor, the balance between doubt and evidence has begun to shift. The ocean is no longer asking only to be heard. It is beginning to demand a response. The response begins not with weapons but with geometry. On the charts spread across the bridge, pencil lines gradually replace imagination with measured possibility. Bearings collected over many minutes are compared against the convoy's own course and speed, producing estimated positions that remain carefully provisional. No officer mistakes these calculations for certainty. They are simply the best approximation that disciplined observation can offer. The sea continues withholding much of its truth, yet enough fragments have accumulated that inaction now carries its own risks. The escort alters course by only a few degrees. From the deck, the movement feels almost insignificant. A merchant sailor looking across the formation might notice nothing beyond the familiar weaving pattern that escorts perform throughout every crossing. Beneath the surface, however, that gentle turn changes the relationship between ship and sound. Echoes begin arriving from slightly different angles. Distances compress or expand by small but meaningful amounts. The operator watches the contact respond to this new geometry with quiet concentration, resisting the temptation to interpret every change as confirmation. Once again, patience proves more valuable than speed. You remain within the compartment as routine acquires an unfamiliar intensity without abandoning its essential character. The same notebook continues filling with careful handwriting. The same headphones rest comfortably against well-practiced ears. The same indicator lamps glow with understated steadiness across the equipment. Nothing in the room announces that it has entered a more consequential moment. Only the quality of attention has changed. Every observation now carries greater weight because each one immediately influences the decisions unfolding elsewhere aboard. Across the convoy, the protective screen begins behaving as a coordinated whole rather than a collection of individual ships. Wireless messages remain brief, avoiding unnecessary detail while conveying exactly what neighboring escorts require. Bearings are exchanged. Positions acknowledged. Estimated movements compared. None of the operators can hear precisely what the others hear, yet together they assemble a broader understanding than any single compartment could achieve alone. Listening, once an individual discipline, gradually becomes a collective one. This cooperation reflects years of institutional learning that extended far beyond any single voyage. Early in the war, anti-submarine operations often suffered because valuable fragments of information remained isolated aboard individual ships. Experience slowly demonstrated that modest observations, shared consistently, could reveal patterns invisible from one perspective alone. Convoys therefore became not merely formations of vessels but communities of perception, each escort contributing another listening post to the immense acoustic landscape of the Atlantic. The operator senses this larger network without ever seeing it directly. Somewhere beyond the horizon, another destroyer may be following a similar contact through its own headphones. Elsewhere, a corvette adjusts speed after receiving the latest bearings. None of these crews witness one another's work, yet they remain quietly connected through reports whose language has been refined by necessity. Precision replaces flourish. Clarity replaces confidence unsupported by evidence. In such circumstances, careful understatement becomes a form of mutual respect. The sea itself offers no encouragement. Beneath its surface, sound continues bending through invisible layers of differing temperature and pressure. Small schools of fish drift across the acoustic field before moving away again. The escort's own propellers generate familiar harmonics that must constantly be separated from external echoes. Nothing becomes easier simply because the situation has grown more important. If anything, the ocean seems determined to remind everyone involved that certainty remains a privilege rarely granted during underwater warfare. On the bridge, the commanding officer weighs another decision. To continue observing preserves convoy integrity but risks allowing a genuine submarine greater freedom of movement. To investigate more aggressively may expose part of the escort screen while consuming time and fuel in pursuit of an uncertain contact. Neither choice offers comfort. Both demand judgment exercised under conditions that can never be completely understood in the moment. Responsibility, he knows, consists not in eliminating uncertainty but in acting wisely despite it. Below, the operator notices something that has become increasingly rare during the past several hours. The contact does not merely persist. It begins answering the escort's movement. As the ship alters course, the bearing changes with a consistency difficult to attribute to weather alone. The relationship is subtle, emerging only through successive observations patiently compared rather than dramatic revelation. One notation in the logbook means little. 5 carefully spaced entries begin suggesting intention. 10 create a pattern that deserves the attention it has now received. Another report rises quietly to the bridge. Its wording remains restrained. Its confidence has grown. The voyage has crossed an invisible threshold. The work inside the sonar compartment is no longer concerned primarily with discovering whether something unusual exists beneath the sea. That question is gradually yielding to another, far more demanding one. If an unseen vessel truly lies beyond the next echo, what is the most responsible way to meet it without losing sight of the convoy that remains the escort's first and greatest duty? The answer will not arrive in a single sound. It will emerge, as everything else has, through disciplined listening carried patiently forward into the next watch. The burden of being right. The longer the investigation continues, the more responsibility shifts from the equipment to the people interpreting it. The machinery has performed its task faithfully. It has gathered echoes, transformed vibrations into electrical signals, and delivered them with remarkable consistency to the operator's headphones. Yet the equipment cannot decide whether a convoy should alter course. It cannot weigh the value of protecting dozens of merchant ships against the possibility of pursuing a contact that may ultimately prove harmless. Those decisions belong entirely to human judgment, and judgment is shaped as much by experience, restraint, and memory as by technology. The operator understands this more clearly now than he did during his first days at sea. Training had taught him how to recognize sounds. Months of convoy duty have taught him something more subtle. Every report carries consequences extending far beyond the compartment in which it is written. A single sentence entered into the logbook may eventually influence the movements of thousands of sailors scattered across an entire convoy. That awareness does not encourage dramatic language. It encourages humility. The contact remains present, though never generously so. It continues revealing only fragments of itself, refusing to become either unmistakably threatening or comfortably innocent. At times it strengthens enough that the operator feels the quiet satisfaction of growing confidence. Then the sea alters once more, softening the signal until certainty retreats another step beyond reach. The ocean seems determined to remind everyone aboard that knowledge beneath the surface is always partial, always earned, and never entirely complete. You watch the rhythm of the compartment settle into something deeper than routine. Earlier watches had been occupied primarily with listening. Now equal attention is given to remembering. Every fresh observation is immediately compared with those recorded hours before. Bearings are traced mentally across the operator's growing internal map of the sea. Slight differences in tone, interval, and persistence are considered not as isolated events but as parts of a much longer conversation extending across several days. The act of listening has quietly become an act of historical comparison. Outside, the convoy continues fulfilling the purpose for which it was assembled. Merchant vessels maintain their stations despite changing weather and uncertain danger. Crews repair small mechanical faults before they become larger ones. Cargo remains securely lashed beneath canvas covers dampened by sea spray and rain. Men write letters they cannot yet send, shave before narrow mirrors fixed to vibrating bulkheads, and gather briefly around mugs of tea before returning to watches that resemble yesterday's in almost every respect. Their ordinary labor continues because the extraordinary work of protection remains largely invisible. This contrast gives convoy warfare its distinctive emotional character. Many aboard the merchant ships may never realize how often unseen decisions preserve the routine upon which their own lives depend. They judge the voyage by whether meals continue arriving, engines continue turning, and the horizon remains free from visible attack. Beneath those reassuring appearances lies another layer of work entirely, carried out inside compartments where every hour is devoted to preventing disruption before disruption becomes visible. The sonar operator seldom receives immediate confirmation that his caution has been justified. If the convoy crosses safely without attack, No one can confidently declare whether danger was successfully avoided or simply absent from the beginning. If an escort investigates a contact that later proves inconclusive, was valuable time wasted, or was disaster quietly prevented by forcing a submarine to remain cautious? Such questions rarely produce final answers. They remain suspended within memory long after the voyage has ended. This uncertainty gradually reshapes how experienced operators think about success itself. They cease measuring accomplishment solely through confirmed sinkings or dramatic engagements. Instead, they begin recognizing quieter achievements that leave almost no visible trace. A convoy arrives intact. Merchant captains unload their cargoes in distant ports. Families receive food, fuel, ammunition, medical supplies, and letters that continue crossing oceans despite every effort made to interrupt them. The absence of catastrophe becomes evidence of countless disciplined decisions that history rarely records in detail. The bridge, meanwhile, continues balancing information with remarkable patience. Fresh bearings from neighboring escorts contribute additional perspective without removing ambiguity. Intelligence summaries suggest areas where enemy submarines have previously operated, yet the ocean rarely respects human expectations. Weather forecasts indicate calmer conditions during the coming day, potentially improving underwater listening while also allowing submarines greater freedom to observe the convoy through their periscopes. Every new piece of information clarifies one aspect of the situation while complicating another. As afternoon light gradually softens toward evening, the operator notices a subtle change that no instrument could have measured directly. He no longer listens in the hope of proving himself correct. He listens in the hope of protecting others from his own mistakes. It is a small transformation, quiet enough that no one else aboard is likely to notice. Yet it marks the moment when technical skill becomes mature responsibility, and when hearing finally gives way to wisdom. Night returns with remarkable gentleness. The last color drains slowly from the western horizon until sea and sky become difficult to distinguish except where starlight occasionally touches the crests of longer swells. Wartime regulations keep visible lighting to a minimum. Portholes remain carefully shaded. Deck lamps are shielded. Cigarettes are smoked discreetly, their brief glow protected by cupped hands whenever possible. From a distance, the convoy becomes less a collection of ships than a loose constellation of carefully hidden lives moving together across an immense darkness. Below the decks, however, the passage from day into night alters very little. The sonar compartment has always existed beyond ordinary light. Watches continue according to the clock rather than the sun, and the equipment glows with the same restrained illumination that has accompanied every previous shift. If there is a difference, it exists not in appearance but in perception. The knowledge that visibility above has diminished naturally places greater emphasis upon every report arriving from below. Lookouts still scan the darkness with disciplined attention, yet they understand that their eyes now surrender much of the responsibility they carried during daylight. The operator feels this transition without allowing it to disturb his method. He begins another watch exactly as before, reviewing the latest entries, confirming equipment performance, and allowing his hearing to settle gradually into the familiar acoustic landscape surrounding the escort. Experience has taught him never to confuse heightened importance with altered procedure. If the discipline changes simply because the hour has become more dangerous, then the discipline was never truly reliable to begin with. You notice how memory now occupies almost as much space as sound itself. The operator is no longer listening only to the present ocean. He is quietly comparing it with every previous hour of the voyage. A faint mechanical rhythm recalls an observation recorded before dawn 2 days earlier. A subtle change in bearing resembles an entry written during the afternoon watch. Patterns accumulate not because any single moment is decisive, but because the human mind has become capable of carrying an extraordinary archive of small observations that no chart could fully capture. The sea speaks one echo at a time. Understanding emerges only after many echoes have been remembered together. Elsewhere aboard, fatigue has matured into something steadier than simple tiredness. Sailors no longer count the days remaining until landfall with much enthusiasm. Instead, they concentrate upon the immediate rhythm of the ship. Watches are relieved. Meals are prepared. Machinery inspected. Weather noted. Sleep taken whenever opportunity permits. Long voyages encourage a practical acceptance of repetition. Thoughts gradually narrow toward the next few hours because imagining the entire crossing at once becomes unnecessarily exhausting. That narrowing of perspective presents another quiet challenge for those charged with protecting the convoy. Responsibility requires them to think beyond the immediate watch without becoming overwhelmed by it. The commanding officer cannot judge each report only by its present significance. He must also consider fuel reserves that will matter days from now, escort positions that must remain effective tomorrow, and merchant ships whose safe arrival depends upon preserving strength throughout the entire crossing. The sonar operator experiences a similar tension. Every contact deserves careful attention, yet no single observation should be allowed to eclipse the broader pattern unfolding across the voyage. The sea continues, offering only fragments. At times the contact strengthens just enough to encourage confidence before gently retreating once more beneath the surrounding water. Then, for long stretches, nothing unusual appears at all. The headphones carry only the familiar pulse of the convoy advancing through darkness, accompanied by distant machinery and the countless natural sounds that have surrounded every watch since departure. It would be easy to mistake these quieter intervals for relief. Experienced operators know better. Silence is simply another condition requiring careful observation. History often remembers anti-submarine warfare through its moments of visible violence: destroyers racing across rough seas, depth charges erupting beneath towering columns of water, damaged submarines struggling toward the surface, or merchant ships disappearing beneath smoke and flame. Yet those dramatic episodes occupied only a small fraction of the lives spent aboard escort vessels. Far more common were nights like this one, when the greatest achievement consisted of maintaining concentration despite the absence of decisive events. Endurance, not excitement, defined the profession. The operator briefly removes one earphone to acknowledge the arrival of fresh tea placed quietly beside the console by another sailor before returning immediately to his work. The exchange requires almost no words. None are necessary. Across the ship, countless similar acts of consideration quietly sustain the crew. A warm drink delivered during the middle of a night watch. A freshly sharpened pencil left beside the logbook. Equipment checked before relief arrives. Such gestures rarely appear in official reports, yet they form the unseen fabric of endurance upon which every longer voyage depends. Hours continue slipping past with almost imperceptible grace. New entries appear in the logbook, each one precise, restrained, and deliberately free from speculation. The contact remains unresolved. The convoy remains intact. The escort continues its patient circuit through darkness beneath a sky whose stars seem as ancient and indifferent as the sea itself. By the end of the watch, the operator recognizes a truth that cannot be taught inside any classroom. The burden of being right is not carried during the moment when certainty finally arrives. It is carried during all the quiet hours beforehand, when responsible people continue observing faithfully despite knowing that the evidence before them will never be complete. After the echoes fade. Every convoy, no matter how long or difficult its crossing, eventually approaches a coast. The first signs rarely appear as dramatic landmarks rising from the sea. More often they arrive through small changes patiently noticed by experienced crews. Seabirds remain nearby instead of vanishing toward the horizon. Fishing vessels begin appearing where open ocean had long offered only merchant ships and escorts. The smell carried by the wind acquires faint traces of earth beneath the familiar salt. Wireless traffic grows more frequent as shore stations enter range once again. Gradually, almost without anyone marking the exact moment, the immense isolation of the Atlantic begins giving way to the quieter certainty that land exists just beyond sight. For the sonar operator, this transition produces mixed emotions. The relief is genuine. Weeks of disciplined listening have gradually accumulated into a fatigue deeper than ordinary tiredness. Yet another feeling accompanies it, more difficult to describe. The headphones that have rested across familiar ears for so many hours are about to become unnecessary, at least for a little while. The acoustic landscape that has quietly shaped every waking day will soon be replaced by streets, buildings, conversations, and ordinary civilian sounds that seem strangely unfamiliar after prolonged time at sea. The final watches of the voyage retain their discipline despite the growing awareness that the crossing is nearly complete. Equipment is inspected with the same care as on the first day. Bearings are recorded with equal precision. No one aboard assumes that danger politely withdraws simply because a destination lies closer than before. History contains too many examples of ships lost within sight of safe harbor for experienced sailors to surrender caution prematurely. Professionalism requires that the last hour resemble the first. You watch the operator settle once again before the console, now surrounded by a quiet familiarity earned through repetition rather than novelty. The compartment no longer feels mysterious. Every switch, cable, notebook, and indicator lamp has become part of an environment understood almost instinctively. The machinery that once seemed intimidating now resembles an old companion whose habits require little conscious thought. Such intimacy develops only through time. It cannot be hurried by instruction nor replaced by technical knowledge alone. Outside, the convoy slowly begins loosening the rigid geometry that has governed its existence across the open ocean. Individual merchant ships prepare for different destinations. Harbor pilots will soon board selected vessels. Escorts anticipate new assignments, fresh fuel, overdue maintenance, replacement crews, and perhaps another convoy assembling before many days have passed. The great formation that crossed an ocean together will gradually dissolve into separate lives once more, each continuing a journey that extends beyond the voyage just completed. The sonar logs receive their final entries with the same restrained handwriting that filled the first pages weeks earlier. Anyone reading them years later might initially mistake their careful language for emotional distance. Bearings, weather, equipment status, contacts observed, contacts lost, watches relieved. Yet beneath that measured vocabulary lies an extraordinary accumulation of concentration. Every line represents minutes or hours during which another human being remained faithfully attentive to sounds that almost no one else aboard ever heard. The contact that accompanied so much of the crossing has long since disappeared. Whether it belonged to a submarine that abandoned pursuit, an acoustic deception shaped by the sea, or a genuine danger discouraged by cautious escort tactics may never be known with complete certainty. The ocean keeps such answers with remarkable consistency. Unlike battlefields scattered with visible evidence, underwater warfare often leaves only incomplete records and remembered impressions. Many questions remain suspended beneath the surface long after the ships themselves have safely reached port. This lingering uncertainty becomes part of the operator's memory. He carries away not dramatic certainty but disciplined ambiguity. He learns that some responsibilities end without perfect resolution. Some correct decisions can never be fully proven. Some lives may have been protected by actions whose necessity will forever remain impossible to demonstrate. The value of the work therefore rests not upon confirmation alone, but upon the integrity with which uncertainty was managed. Soon the headphones will be hung carefully upon their familiar hook. The compartment will grow quiet. Another crew will eventually occupy the same chairs. Fresh logbooks will replace the old ones. The sea, indifferent to every individual voyage, will continue speaking in the same patient language it has always used. Only the listeners will change. When the ship finally enters harbor, the first sensation is often not excitement but stillness. After weeks spent adjusting unconsciously to the steady movement of the Atlantic, solid ground possesses an unfamiliar certainty. Footsteps no longer compensate for the slow rise and fall beneath the deck. Buildings remain motionless. Railway whistles, truck engines, bicycle bells, church clocks, and ordinary conversations drift through the air with a clarity quite different from the filtered world inside the headphones. For many sailors, these sounds feel unexpectedly loud, not because they truly are, but because the mind has spent so long separating meaning from faint echoes carried beneath water that everyday life briefly seems almost overwhelming. The sonar operator leaves the ship carrying remarkably little that identifies his profession. There is no distinctive trophy earned from a successful watch, no visible mark separating him from the engineers, signalmen, cooks, or deck crews who have shared the crossing. His notebooks remain aboard as official records. His equipment stays carefully maintained for the next voyage. What he carries away instead exists almost entirely within memory: the rhythm of familiar propellers, the subtle difference between calm and storm beneath the sea, the patience required to allow uncertainty its proper place before reaching judgment. Maintenance crews soon descend into the compartment. Panels are opened. Vacuum tubes are inspected and replaced where necessary. Electrical connections are cleaned of salt carried invisibly through weeks at sea. Moving parts receive fresh lubrication. Headphones are tested, cables coiled neatly, switches exercised one by one to ensure they remain dependable. The work resembles that performed upon engines, guns, radios, and every other system aboard the escort. Equipment survives war not because it is extraordinary, but because ordinary people quietly preserve it between voyages. Reliability is built as much in peaceful harbors as upon dangerous oceans. Elsewhere, instructors continue training new operators who have not yet experienced their first convoy. They sit inside classrooms much like those described at the beginning of this journey, listening to recordings that initially seem confusing and indistinct. Their notebooks contain fresh pages untouched by salt air. Their questions resemble those asked by every generation before them. Experienced veterans occasionally visit these schools, though they seldom offer dramatic stories. More often they speak about patience, accurate reporting, careful documentation, and the quiet discipline of admitting uncertainty when uncertainty honestly exists. Such lessons may sound almost modest to inexperienced ears, yet they have been purchased through thousands of hours spent listening across open oceans. You begin to notice how rarely history pauses beside these quieter professions for very long. Naval campaigns are often remembered through the names of famous admirals, celebrated battles, or decisive technological innovations. Maps show convoy routes stretching across the Atlantic, while statistics record ships launched, ships lost, cargo delivered, and submarines destroyed. Those numbers matter because they reveal the scale of the conflict. Yet they cannot fully convey the human experience of sitting alone in a dim compartment for hour after hour, protecting strangers through concentration that left almost no visible trace. Perhaps that is why the work retains such quiet dignity. It reminds us that history is not sustained only by moments of extraordinary courage. More often, It is carried forward by ordinary competence repeated faithfully over long periods of time. The sonar operator did not need to become fearless. He needed to remain careful after midnight, attentive during uneventful afternoons, honest when evidence remained incomplete, and disciplined when fatigue encouraged simpler answers than reality was prepared to offer. Those qualities seldom occupy monuments, yet they preserve lives with remarkable consistency. Today, many of the escort vessels have disappeared into museums, breakwaters, or photographs fading gently inside archives. The equipment that once represented advanced technology now appears almost reassuringly mechanical beside modern electronics. Visitors walking through preserved compartments often pause before the sonar console, noticing the headphones, switches, and dials without immediately appreciating the extraordinary patience they once demanded. The room appears smaller than expected, quieter, less dramatic than popular imagination had suggested. And perhaps that is exactly as it should be, because the Real story was never hidden inside the machinery. It lived within the people who learned to listen without rushing to conclude, who accepted uncertainty without surrendering responsibility, and who understood that protecting others often begins with paying careful attention to things almost no one else can hear. Outside, the tide continues its timeless exchange with the shore. Wind moves gently across the harbor before carrying its breath toward the open sea, where countless layers of water still bend and carry sound exactly as they did during the war. Somewhere beneath those waves, echoes continue traveling through darkness without memory of the ships that once pursued them or the men who patiently interpreted their passage. The ocean has kept its language. Only its listeners have changed. You've been part of Echoes of War, where stories rise on quiet wings, and the past still circles above us, refusing to land.